Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Institute for Government webinar on the King's Speech. We've seen the pomp and circumstance. Personally speaking, I've seen rather too much pomp and circumstance, having been stuck on the wrong side of the Mall to the IFG for the last 45 minutes, watching carriages and crowns and various people process up and down the Mall, but unable to get here. So a big apology for my late arrival, meaning we're starting this webinar a little late. But we're here now, and we have a fantastic set of people here to analyse what we've just seen in the King's Speech. Many of you will have watched the ceremony, heard King Charles read out the bills that the government wants to get onto the statute book, and MPs, many of whom will have been going through this experience for the first time and now milling around Parliament and making sense of what they've heard. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about what bills the government is planning to bring forward, what they tell us about Keir Starmer's priorities, which ministers are going to be busiest in the weeks and months ahead, which departments are going to have to do the heavy lifting, where the potential rows may lie within the Labour Party and Parliament more generally, and how hard or easy it's going to be to get some of these bills through Parliament. As I said, we've got a great panel here today to discuss all these things. Joining me are two IFG experts who are both veterans of many of these big constitutional moments. That's Jill Rutter and Alex Thomas. Hello, both. You're allowed to turn your mics on until it's your go. And I'm delighted to also be joined by Chris White. Chris leads SEC Newgate's public affairs team, and in a former life was a government advisor, the government advisor in charge of getting legislation through Parliament. Hi, Chris.
Good afternoon.
So we've got lots to discuss, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm hoping that everybody listening at home also has lots of questions. Please do start sending them in via Slido, and I will weave them into the webinar throughout our hour together here today. So, Alex, I'm going to kick off with you. You wrote a comment for us, which is on our website before the King's Speech, saying that Keir Starmer had to come up with more than just a list of legislation and set out clearly what his priorities for government are. Do you have a sense that he has or is going to do that?
Ish, I suppose, is the unsatisfying answer, but at least it's not. At least it's not no. I mean, inevitably, it was a list of legislation. The part of the purpose of this moment is to set out the legislation that the government currently intends to put before Parliament. So there was plenty of that in there. But the reason for optimism, and we will see more on this, I suspect, with Starmer's speech in Parliament after he's kindly waiting for the webinar to finish before he gives his speech. So you can watch that this afternoon. And then particularly as this kind of continues through the various processes, budget spending reviews that we're expecting over the coming months, there was a sense of a theme. And it was, the first kind of minute or so of the King's Speech, I was thinking, oh, this is quite good, because it didn't launch into a series of bills. It talked about, there was a kind of narrative around growth leading into planning and house building, leading into decentralization and devolution. And that kind of came through quite strongly as a theme. And as well as a theme, it was a sense of priorities. I do think sitting here now, and okay, a lot of it we knew already because it was in the manifesto or it had been pre-briefed or whatever, but we do have a sense of what the government's priorities are, and I think that will help the civil service and others try and kind of deal with some of those trade-offs. It is, they are really going for the planning stuff, whatever the specific measures kind of come out. That is clearly a top priority, leading to growth and stability. They're serious about decentralization. There was a bit of a sense before the election, how is this going to play out inside with the internal kind of Labour Party dynamics? This is a thing. So I do think we do have a sense of priorities. I was also just before this looking at the kind of the first lines of the last 4 or 5 Kings, Queens speeches, and I think that is interesting, and it gives us a sense of how things have shifted. 2019, the first line was all about Brexit, and as you'd expect, getting Brexit done. 2021, it was all about the pandemic. 2022, levelling up. 23, Ukraine. This year started with missions, which was again interesting to get right at the top of the speech, which I think was a good thing, into stability and growth. So yeah, we did get that list of 40 bills that was kind of covered and is part of the briefing that has also just come out from number 10 in the Cabinet Office, but it did give a kind of a sense of things. I also think there was a really interesting, we may come on to this, political dividing line around stability. The start of the speech was all about stability, which again, when you look at the detailed briefing, makes explicit contrast with Liz Truss and what happened at times under the previous Conservative government. So there was both a sort of sense of political dividing lines and something of a set of priorities. The critical thing that we will be watching now is how and whether those priorities are properly translated into particularly a spending review as it comes. If we have a 3-year spending review or possibly a 1-year spending review and then a 3-year spending review after that, how are they aligning budgets and the mechanics and all the kind of weight of the system to these priorities? Because lots of focus and attention will go on what happens in Parliament. It's quite easy to get the headline about the bills and introducing the legislation, but actually kind of grinding the gears of government through how they allocate budgets and how they actually transact all these missions will be the test of whether the priorities that we do now seem to have fairly clearly are properly kind of transacted.
And just to follow up on what you said about those priorities, Alex, do you think that the emphasis on the planning and the sort of devolution aspect is a sign that Labour almost thinks those are the hardest things that they're going to have to do, and therefore it's important to do them early while they've got momentum, and potentially even before some of the people who might object have found their feet in the new Parliament?
Possibly. Who could possibly imagine? Yes, I think hardest because most complicated, but also hardest because the areas where they'll need to spend most capital, and also, clearly with something like planning, I mean, they'll be lucky if they see a meaningful return on that in 5 years, let alone kind of 2 or 3 years that it might happen. So if you're going to do it, you really do need to crack on with it straight away. So I think that it does also, you're right to pick up on it. It speaks to a sort of long-termist view. So the sort of the 10-year plan, they get re-elected or not. So again, sort of cautiously positive on that. The other thing I noticed, which speaks to quite a few of these things, is there's quite, and I absolutely am not saying this to disparage the legislation, it's quite processy. I mean, so quite the opposite, I think, particularly at IFG, process and the way you do things, the way you go about governing and how decisions are made really, really matters. So it did strike me that the planning stuff is a lot about improving the process of planning rather than kind of saying exactly where it will happen or when. Process around devolution and decentralisation, the means of governing, the stability. I mean, Lord save us from more locks, but the quote unquote fiscal lock on requiring the OBR to analyse more of the decisions that the Treasury makes is a process question. So in a good way, I think they're trying to get the process stuff in place early, so that then that will hopefully pay dividends on the substance as the government continues.
Very interesting. Chris, you've seen a few King's speeches in your time. Do you agree with Alex on that point he makes about the sort of process focus? How does this compare, this speech, in terms of ambition versus realism compared to others you've seen?
Yeah, I thought it was certainly ambitious in the size of the number of bills that are being put forward. I think it's around 40, is it, that is listed in the King's speech and the 105-page briefing pack that the government has so helpfully pumped out, and which I've been skim reading in the last 20 minutes. But what it does is it structures the missions, or all of the legislation around the missions, which is really quite helpful because, for Labour trying to tell the story of what it's trying to do to the electorate and really get a sense of drive and mission focus, I think that enables both, as Alex said, the civil service to really row in behind and understand what the government's trying to achieve, but also to try and communicate that to the electorate and showcase that they are delivering and making a start on delivering the promises that they've made. And I thought that the biggest issue for the last sort of few Queens and Kings speeches that we've had has been that they've ended up being very bitty and tactical in the sense that, you know, governments are trying to tackle individual problems. And you look at Rishi Sunak's equivalent of the 5 missions or, you know, targets that he was trying to achieve. They were sort of, you know, stop the boats, do this. It was all very micro. Whereas this is actually, you've got the 5 themes around economic stability and growth. And you've got something like 12 or 14 bills listed under that, which are going to be driving that forward. And you've got the Great British Energy, secure borders, and so on. So there's a real thematic sense that the government know what they're going to get into. And there were no surprises really in this. I think the only one that I sort of registered was vote 16 sort of possibly dropping off from the first session. And, you know, how long the first session is going to be is another question on this as well. You know, in the coalition in 2010, we did a 2-year first session because we had so much to do and deliver. This Labour government may do the same or may run it slightly longer for 18 months because this is quite a lot to get through. But I think the biggest things for me, 2 things I'd say: the planning reform. I cannot underestimate or understate how significant this is going to be for the business sector, because there are, you know, clients we've been working with here at SEC Newgate, which have been working for 5 years, one of which was approved last week under Ed Miliband, one of the really significant solar farms. And, you know, the amount of red tape that you need to deliver, 76,000 pages of red tape to get through. And if that can really drive forward some of the planning reform, then yes, you might just about start to see some of the reforms have an impact by the time of the next election, which is crazy to say when you think about how slow the planning system is in the UK. I think the other thing which may sort of sweep under the carpet a little bit will be the significant measures around devolution as well. So if you think about how centralised the UK state is, we've had metro mayors now for a decade or more, haven't we, since the, again, coalition government introduced them. But because of the very nature of a Conservative Whitehall government and mostly Labour metro mayors, there's kind of been butting heads for quite a long period of time. But there were 2 things. Firstly, the new powers and the request for new powers for metro mayors, and beginning to create a sort of list of powers for which metro mayors can either new ones be bid for or bring them in. But it's also about this sense of working together. There was a line in the King's speech about combined authorities, metro mayors, Whitehall, all working together to try and drive growth and ambition. And I think actually that could have much more impact, you know, when you add it to the planning reforms, local bus deregulation, what's going to go on with the nationalised railways and the impact that will have in terms of delivering transport locally. That will have, I think, a really significant impact on what Labour will deliver by the end of the Parliament as well.
And you said there, Chris, that of course they may run this session long. The legislation they're saying that they want to bring forward in this session, but also because when you're starting off as a new government, you haven't, you know, they may have drafted some things in opposition, but they've really got to get the parliamentary draftsman going to draft up some of this stuff, even if it's ready to go and they don't need to consult on some of the subjects. I have to say the most popular question that's come through already on Slido is from Charlie Gordon. And don't forget, you can uprate questions if you like them and want them to be asked rather than just asking them again yourself on Slido. But to you, Chris, Charlie's asking, will there be room for any other legislation in this session? Can we expect anything else? So just tell us about that. How does that really work for governments? They do other things as well, right?
Yeah, they do. I mean, but crikey, 40 bills is a lot to get through. You know, these are, I mean, it depends. Some of them will be really what I call significant bills, like 100 clauses plus, which will take up a lot of time, a lot of scrutiny. Others will take a lot less time. You know, if you're just doing, you know, banning smoking, for example, it's, you know, a much smaller bill, much quicker to get through, although politically contentious potentially on all sides. There's always stuff that crops up in a session where you have to respond to the political imperative of the time, whether it be a piece of emergency legislation that crops up because, you know, there's a judicial decision that you have to respond to tighten up the law, or there's a usual kind of knife crime bill or something in response to an event that's happened. As you go forward, I noticed that zombie knives have been banned yet again for the umpteenth time. I mean, it's we've seen it so many times, but how many times can you sort of edit the law again and again and again. So look, these, yes, you have to respond. There will be a little bit of wiggle room, but not much. I mean, I can sense that the PPS, the chief whip, business managers and so on will be tearing their hair out thinking how on earth they cram this in, because if you think about a parliamentary session, the House of Commons is a limiting time, really, where you only have 75 days in a normal 1 year session that the government is actually in control of. And that sounds a lot. But when you think about all the stages of all these bills you have to go through, committee report stage, some of them will require committee of the whole House, particularly where they're constitutional bills. And there's a little bit of me with my old hat on. I'm glad I'm not trying to sort of squeeze all of this into the session. But we'll see. We'll see.
And all those new cabinet ministers clamouring to get their bill through first. Jill, what do you agree with Chris and Alex? What did you take away as the top line you think the government wants us to take away from this King's Speech?
Well, I think the basic message is we said we'd do things in our manifesto and now we're getting into action. So I think it's quite interesting that they're setting out the bills in a similar way to the way they presented the manifesto, and in all those areas they can then point to action. I think one of the things that's quite welcome in it is that they don't seem to feel the need that you have to weigh the number of bills to show things are important. So, for example, health only gets two bills, one on mental health and one is the Rishi Sunak Memorial Tobacco and Vapes Bill returning. So there isn't that, and I think people were very relieved there isn't yet another reorganisation of the NHS bill. I mean, people remember that dominated the Cameron session, not entirely successfully, but watch to see if Chris winces about that. So I think that's quite good. I mean, in the King's Speech, the King said we're setting up an industrial strategy council, but there isn't a bill to do that sort of mention. So I think they're sort of not legislating where they don't need to. I think one of the things that's quite interesting is that one reason why I think there's so many bills is they seem to have broken them down into quite bite-sized chunks. I don't know whether you and Chris who probably know more about legislation than I do. You could have combined the National Wealth Fund and the GB Energy bills into one if you wanted. Instead, we have one Treasury bill, one Department of Energy Security and Net Zero bill to do that, and another bill to extend the powers of the Crown Estate. Those three together provide quite a lot of the building blocks for the clean power mission, but rather than have one omnibus bill, they seem to be sort of restricting scope where they can, which I think is an interesting approach to legislation. May reflect that we have a lot of lawyers in this government and they have particular views on how to do this and how you avoid being ambushed by annoying amendments that a wide scope of a bill might permit. So I think it's quite interesting how they're doing it, and some of the sort of topics. Some of the shoehorning into missions is a bit odd. I'm not sure the football governance bill would have been top of the opportunity mission, yet it's one of the counts into sort of 7 bills under that. So some of it's a bit weird presentation, but I think in the sense that this is a government that's come to do various things, what they're about, and we're now aligning our legislative programme with that. I think they've given a pretty clear indication that that's what they're doing.
Thanks, Jill. I'll let you answer Jill's question, Chris, if you'd like to. I mean, I think from a parliamentary scrutiny point of view, there are some benefits to having more single-purpose bills because it means that the Lords, the Commons, can get their teeth into the key purpose of a bill rather than having to divide their attentions between numerous different things that the bill is trying to do if you cram them into a sort of big Christmas tree, as well as the scope issues that Jill highlights. But what would you say, having thought about these sorts of issues yourself?
Yeah, it's a delicate balance to strike because Christmas trees are beneficial in the Commons because they, ultimately it's the same window of opportunity for scrutiny, in that you put knives in the debating period, or you limit the number of days for report. It goes upstairs to committee. You limit the length of time that committee can scrutinise it. But in the Lords, sometimes they can actually take longer to debate those because peers will say, well, okay, there's so much to unpack here, we need more time, and time is just an elastic quantity in the House of Lords. Whereas I think if you flip it the other way around, if you have more individual smaller scale bills in the Commons, then that eats into your 75 days of saying, well, each bill needs a second reading, each bill needs a sort of report and third reading day. So it's, you're trying to find a balance between the two. I personally tend to prefer smaller scope bills because it gives a sense of purpose, and you tend to get a smaller group of potential opposition. I'm putting my old Whipsoft hat on here and say you'll only get a small number of irritated people, MPs, opposing you on a particular segment which you can sort of try and contain, rather than sort of packaging it all together and saying, right, well, I've now got 4 or 5 different fights that I need to have, and they all might unite together. So I think from that perspective, it really, really works. And I think the other thing actually, which I think, can't believe I'm mentioning secondary legislation at this point in the podcast, but I did see that the new Attorney General Richard Hermer say in his swearing-in speech this week that there was a real intention not to abuse the power of secondary legislation, and I know this is something the Hansard Society has been fighting very hard on, about the really appalling state of scrutiny in the Commons in particular on secondary legislation. And I think if the government is making that commitment now, that really does bode well in terms of not giving ministers too much power in the future to do a significant amount of changes to what really should be done under primary legislation. So from my point of view, I think that's really, really positive step.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And it was something that Lucy Powell, the now leader of the House, did say at the IFG when she spoke here before the election, but it's really good to see that intention at least reaffirmed post-election. Chris, just another process question before we move on to some of the content in more detail. Can you just remind us who owns this now? We know that Lucy Powell in opposition was doing a lot of the work in terms of drawing together this programme for the King's Speech and looking at what all the different teams wanted to bring forward and trying to sort of push that prioritisation that has to happen. But does it now hand over to the Chief Whip to get this stuff through?
Yeah, it's a kind of almost like a trade-off or a kind of, there's a handover point where anything before it enters the Commons is responsibility of the leader of the House. I'm assuming that they're still chairing Parliamentary Business and Legislation Committee. And they will be the one that will summon in the minister to say, right, is your bill ready for introduction? What's your handling strategy like? Have you got all of the papers that you need to submit ready? Have we squared away potential rebels and so on? And then when it actually comes to the Commons or the Lords, that's the point where the individual business managers the Chief Whips will take it forward and deal with the fires and try and put them out as it crops up. But from a process point of view, the business managers, all 4 of them, will work really, really closely together. They will have a weekly or fortnightly meeting where they'll talk about the bills as they progress through both sides and understand where the pressure points are and really try and make sure that they are ahead of the game as much as they possibly can be. So early on, I'd say the leader of the House will have a lot of influence in a session in terms of what bills will arrive when. But as the session progresses through and you're sort of fighting the fires and the bills progress through both chambers, then it tends to be more the Chief Whips that will take a controlling handle on the steering wheel. Although I will say that the PPS, the Chief Whip, inevitably will be the sort of unifying point that everybody will circulate around.
Really?
I was just going to come. Sorry, Hannah, I was just going to come on that really briefly because Chris is bringing back memories of if you're in a policy team and you've got a bill in your area, the call you really dread is from the PPS to the Chief Whip. Used to be Roy Stone, is no longer, but sort of summoning you in for a good old dressing down because your bill's gone off course or there are more problems than associated with it. So it's the call that sends a chill down your spine if you're a deputy director or a director in civil service with a controversial bill in your area.
We're giving Alex a PTSD here. And I was just thinking, actually, Chris, as you were talking, the benefit for government of having more of these single purpose bills is the opportunity to give new MPs the opportunity to sit on a bill committee and be sort of sheep dipped through that process and give them something to do and keep them busy. Alex, turning back to the content of the bill, content of the speech. What do you think are the most ambitious bills that we can see in there? What are the things which are going to be, making the most difference policy-wise, but also likely to to require the most meaty scrutiny as they're taken through by the cabinet minister?
Yeah, I think we've touched on the most ambitious ones already to some extent. So planning and infrastructure, absolutely. I mean, that's going to create all sorts of hullabaloo possibly in the Commons more than in the Lords. And it was Boris Johnson's attempt at planning reform failed because of backbench rebellions in the Commons. You would expect them to be able to get that through with this huge majority and with a different makeup of seats. Although interesting thing about Labour having lots more rural seats now is that might be more challenging. I think the devolution stuff will, is as they go on with it, really ambitious. But we've covered that. I think one of the things, well, actually, two other quick points on the ambition, setting up these new institutions. We know Keir Starmer is quite an institutionalist. Setting up Great British Railways, Great British Energy, those things. I think you can set those up, but actually, for them to be a success, is a high level of ambition, and to create the conditions for success, really good scrutiny from the Commons and the Lords to say, well, what are these organisations actually going to do? What will their powers be? How will they be run? How will they be held accountable? Is a really meaty job for Parliament to do. So I think that's a kind of high ambition one. The other one that stood out for me in terms of policy ambition, and this is not a particular area of policy expertise, but just reading the 105 pages of briefing that Chris mentioned in 20 minutes, the Renters' Rights Bill seemed quite chunky in terms of substance, and quite a lot of things that have been difficult for successive governments and have been promised and then abandoned and kind of sidetracked. So there are, in the sort of second tier legislation, if you like, are things that we could be hearing quite a lot about in 6, 9, 12 months time as being quite tricky. The other one, and I can't help but mention it because we love it, is the House of Lords hereditary bill. Was struck by, well, firstly, I was listening for it. There was in 1998, I think it was, there was a famous murmur when the Queen announced the House of Lords reform proposals back then. I was listening for a murmur in the King's Speech, and murmur came there none. So maybe this suggests that they're a bit less truculent than they were back then. But very notable in that Chris mentioned the votes at 16 stuff doesn't seem to be there. The retirement at 80 or at the end of a parliament at 80 doesn't seem to be in there. And they go out of their way in the briefing to say, this is a short and narrowly focused bill. It's only the first step in wider reform. So I think they've clocked some political risks around that and have deliberately, it goes a bit to your kind of smaller bill point, have tried to draw a boundary around removing the hereditaries before they come on to some other, perhaps even more controversial areas of reform.
The time-honoured tradition of House of Lords reform, starting with an ambitious plan and scaling it back. So I'm just going to tell my computer not to restart.
Scars on their back, as we seem to have lost time. Scars on their back, as someone once said about House of Lords reform. The other thing about the House of Lords, I'm filling now, but Jill and Chris come in. But was it goes to Chris's point about there being quite a lot of small bills. So the media is obviously going to fixate on the 40 headline number. It's really worth remembering that 4 of those are draft bills, which is very different to actually introducing the legislation. It may come or it may not. But quite a lot of these, I mean, I don't know, pick a percentage, but a third, somewhere between a third and a half, are actually quite small, relatively uncontroversial bills. I picked up on there's a bill extending provisions around women bishops, which was legislation that I worked on back in the day. But this is not going to be, I mean, there might be a bit of debate on it in the Lords, but this is not going to be hugely controversial. Jill, do you want
some of these did look sort of the slight bills that people asked for in later sessions, I thought. When I was at DEFRA, we used to have our list of bills that we would put up session after session. And if we were lucky, we got them into the final session. They usually didn't make it through at all. And I thought some of these looked like sort of slightly bring out your dead bills, where it was slightly surprising to see them featuring in a first King's Speech. I would have thought I think one of the sort of more omnibus bills is this children's wellbeing bill, which does seem to be taking quite a lot of sort of quite interventionist powers on bits of the education system. And of course, added to this, there will be annual, at least one finance bill a year, if not more than that, which will do things like the VAT on private schools would be obviously contentious. It'd be very interesting whether the sort of improvements to the asylum and immigration process become really contested. We've got used to that being a massive battlegrounds in Parliament, but will the Conservatives use that to focus some of their attack, or will they be too distracted? I think is quite interesting. The bill that I thought was really, really interesting is hiding under the name. This slightly goes against Chris's point on secondary legislation, and I think there'll be a lot of probing as to exactly what is this about, was the brilliantly named product safety and metrology, if that's how you pronounce it. I thought it was about weather forecasting, but it seems to be about measurement. Product safety and metrology bill, which has a really interesting language in it about making the Windsor Framework. That's the deal that the government did, Rishi Sunak did in 2023 with the EU on managing Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland sea border. But they are taking a power to align with EU regulation where it's our sovereign choice. Now, you can imagine in a different parliament, the European Research Group, now reduced in numbers, would be convening star chambers, etc., etc. Because if they're really giving themselves secondary powers to align with EU regulation, then I think that would be very interesting to see how that proceeds through. But quite a lot of businesses may actually be quite hopeful that this is the beginning of a move to much greater alignment with the single market, which would have benefits for that Irish sea border, but obviously has far wider policy implications.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. If you, controversial bill, give it a boring name. A bill that's a bit performative, give it an exciting
I
name.
may be massively over-interpreting there,
we'll
because
see.
I can't see other people getting
I had two other
very
little ones I was
excited
going
about
to. Sorry, Joe. I had two other little ones I was going to pull out. One was the draft conversion therapy legislation. Again, draft, so it will run to a longer timetable. But this was something that this is about LGBT conversion and prescribing it, has been really controversial. Was a sort of became embroiled in some of the culture wars over the course of the last few governments, and the fact this government is reviving it speaks to the different political world that we're in now, the different constituencies that they that they represent. So I wanted to give a shout out to that one. The other one, this goes into sort of civil service and public servants and all the public inquiries that we've been following over the course of the last year or two, it's actually called the Hillsborough Law legislation, but it's about a duty of candour on public officials to be open and honest. It's not exactly clear from the briefing, as far as I could see it, exactly how that will work and how it will supplement the existing codes and requirements to behave properly in public office and so on. But there is it's clearly an intent there to reflect on what's come out of the infected blood inquiry, the Hillsborough inquiry, the post office inquiry, obviously the COVID inquiry, about sort of honesty and effectiveness in public office, which does, again, it feels quite Starmerite, public service, integrity, all of that. The other thing our colleague, I saw Tim Durrant picked up on Twitter, is there doesn't seem to be legislation around ethics or standards. Again, that is something we might have seen, but equally there have been whispers more recently that's something the government wants to do in a non-legislative way. So we'll be building up the existing standards architecture without actually legislating to create a new ethics commissioner.
But what I thought was interesting there, Alex, was that they didn't make that much of that in the statement, because you'd have thought that if you were doing that, you might say, we are looking to work with the existing institutions to make them more robust and such, perhaps with a view to legislating if that proves necessarily later, whereas it rather looks as though there's a bit of a gap. Though I think it'll be interesting when we do see this duty of candour bill and see what it really looks like and what it means for people working in government, working in public institutions, and how much of a sort of row that creates. But I think it might be quite a difficult bill to draft.
Chris, do you want to come in? It's Hannah.
Yeah.
Hannah's rejoining us. Chris, you were going to come in.
Yeah, well, Hannah sort of reboots herself. The thing I was going to say was just actually, look, this is the first session of a 5-year parliament, right? So not everything can be covered. I mean, they made a really good stab at trying to do it through 40 bills. There were, I mean, just on that ethics point, I mean, it may be that the PM needs more time to actually discuss with his ethics advisor and, potentially with standards and privileges in the House as to actually, what is the track that the government wants to take on this and how does it go about reforming the architecture before it comes forward. There's a little bit of me that sort of thinks that the government could have been a little bit bolder on some of these things. So like on defence, for example, there's a review on that John Healey's going to conduct, which will take a good few months on defence expenditure and the state of the armed forces. And I think a lot of people might argue, myself one of them, that actually taking a good few months on this at a time of a huge instability within Europe and globally is maybe not the thing that we need to do, and actually just stepping up the percentage that we spend on GDP and identifying what we can buy off the shelf is a way forward. I thought the other thing that really wasn't mentioned there, which was sort of trailed in the weeks before, a couple of weeks beforehand, was this sort of Royal Commission on Social Care, which just sort of seems to have dropped off the cliff face in terms of any mention in this at all. And it was in the papers, I think over the weekend, where Streeting was sort of suggesting that he was going to pull this all together and engage with political parties and so on, but it wasn't mentioned in here at all. And I thought that was a bit of a shame, because again, that's another really meaty, thorny issue that actually you could have had a signal in there that this is something that the government is wanting to tackle, but maybe social care and laws reform together in the first session of a parliament is too much.
Or with a bit of luck, so we should drop, but they're not. The Royal Commission on Social Care is not exactly gripping the issue immediately. So maybe there are other plans afoot on social care, but we'll see. Sorry to interrupt, Chris.
No, that's fine. And then the last thing I was just going to say is there's quite a lot of bans. So this is a tactic that governments tend to fall into, and it's a little bit of a shame that it's sort of happening quite so quickly under a sort of new Labour government. I mean, you've got under New Deal for working people, there's sort of banning exploitative practice, and there's a smoking ban, the junk food ban, the fizzy drink advertising ban, the conversion practices, and so on. And I just think that as a government, I think they need to think more proactively about what it is they want to do to change culture and behaviour without necessarily resorting to bans. Because as soon as you start going down that route, then it becomes a sort of a race to the what else can we ban as quickly as possible to show that we're taking action, and all that you're actually doing is sort of whack-a-mole on the latest issue that any government or the public think should be banned. So we'll see.
I'm back. Apologies, there's some kind of cosmic conspiracy against my participation in this webinar, I think, but my computer has restarted itself. I don't know if you can now see me. My camera seems to have gone off. Anyway, apologies if any of the questions I now put have already been covered. You'll have to just tell me that. Jill, there were a number of things which were quite familiar, bills that the government seems to be going to pick up that didn't get through at the end of the last parliamentary session. Alex mentioned some of those earlier, but that's quite interesting, isn't it? It's not all new stuff.
No, it's not all new stuff, and I think that's quite good. I mean, we had a sort of a slightly truncated session. There were some things which were clearly agreed across parties. Though one of the things that's quite interesting is I'm seeing some of Michael Gove's former advisors tweeting, why on earth are they just doing a draft bill on leasehold and commonhold? We've done all the work. They could just pick this up and go. There's no need to do that in draft. So I think it's really quite interesting. I think that's quite good. I have to say I was very struck watching them walking to the speech, just quite how animated the conversation between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer seemed to be. I mean, they seem to be having really quite a good chat. I mean, it is quite interesting though with Chris, because of course the sort of mother of all bans is the smoke-free generation ban, which has this rather odd cutoff, which was introduced by Rishi Sunak. Now, I think it'd be interesting to see where the government goes on all of this sort of whatever. But I think it is quite good that where you've had bills cut off, but there was consensus that they do come back, and maybe there are things that the government also can introduce relatively quickly where they need to spend a bit more time. on the drafting of the new things, because there are limits to how much real drafting you can do in opposition, and where you will need to get collective agreement to the content of what you are putting in your own bill. So it may be that there's some things where you can just press the restart button quite quickly and give them second readings and the start of this Parliament. So maybe even in this session after the King's Speech debate concludes.
And Alex, as you mentioned earlier, there's mention right at the top of the King's Speech about the missions approach. What else can you detect from the bills which are mentioned and the wider commentary, as you say, in that long document you've digested, about how the legislative approach the government's planning to take maps against the mission-led government that it's aspiring to lead?
It's interesting. You're I mean, you're kind to say I've digested it. Definitely skimmed rather than snacked on it rather than digested. I mean, it goes a bit to what we were saying earlier. There's a crunch between the sort of list nature of the legislation and the fact they've chunked it up fairly carefully, as we said, and the cross-cutting, mission-driven aspiration around government. So this is almost a sort of exemplification of that tension between sort of cross-cutting mission government and the traditional departmental silos that cause so much problem to that. So this is it's encapsulation of something that we will see more. I think as Chris said, they've done a decent job at trying to kind of tie the legislation to the missions. It does clearly show that they are serious about that. But how then, I mean, an interesting thing to me, how then will these bits of legislation be managed inside Whitehall? Will a mission board be responsible for a set of legislation as well as for pushing through the kind of the non-legislative and the financial money and project management side of doing the things they want to do? So how are these things going to sit in traditional bill teams, in traditional departments, or are they actually going to be managed in a new way? Where money is associated with a sort of a mission relevant bill, will it be identified with that mission, or will it be managed under a traditional departmental permanent secretary, accounting officer type process? So I think it begs lots of questions that it's reasonable for the government not yet to have answered, but we will want to see through the spending review and beyond. The other shout out, and I think it is interesting in the kind of mission sense as well, is we haven't talked about the future of work, which is the other big, probably should have highlighted that as one of the sort of big ambitious will need scrutiny bills, because there are some specifics in there, but they're quite micro specific. So that's one area where I think the level of aspiration to kind of redefine the future of work is not yet met with a set of specific policies. They talk about the living wage, they talk about certain things around workers' rights, some kind of carefully negotiated language about 0 hours contracts and so on. But that's an area where, and is the future of work key to the opportunity mission, or is the opportunity mission actually all about education and building up standards in schools and children's well-being and skills? So questions still begged, I think.
Lots still to find out. But it's not all about missions, is it? I mean, there's lots of government to be done and lots of things to be done which won't fall within the mission sort of umbrella. And Jill, you were saying before we started this webinar, in the seconds between when I ran into the building and sat down in front of my computer, you think there's an interesting possible straw in the wind about how Labour may approach the question of Europe?
Now, Hannah, I already filled the vacuum caused by your absence to wax on, and that's probably enough for people on the product safety and metrology bill, but do check it out and see what's there. So I think that's really quite interesting. But I have already spoken about that. So
fine, good. Okay, in which case I want to put a question that I spotted here to Chris, which is really kind of a point of information. But Melanie Fields asking whether, when it says in the King's Speech that bills will be published as drafts, so for example, race equality and conversion practices, does that mean for pre-legislative scrutiny, or does it just mean for public consultation?
Yeah, I mean, it usually means for pre-legislative scrutiny, but it can mean either. And it depends how much time the government wants to give on this. They could absolutely do sort of a more traditional sort of, I guess, green paper, white paper route, and then sort of publish sort of chunks to go in, or they could publish a whole draft of the bill and then submit it for pre-legislative scrutiny for a particular select committee or joint committee of the House. And of course, the individual select committee can take public evidence as well. So there'll be plenty of opportunities if people want to give evidence to these and make written submissions to do so. And generally speaking, it's good to see. We haven't had really many draft bills, certainly in the latter half of the previous government's sort of end of the Parliament, for people to give that scrutiny. And actually, generally speaking, it gives a much better consensus to a piece of particular legislation if one can be found. And it means that you get this sort of wider sector as well as Parliament itself behind the reforms that are going to be drawn up and can iron out issues. But the issue is that Parliament itself can probably only sort of handle sort of 5 or 6 pieces of draft legislation in any one session. And that is a limiting factor really on how many bills you can put forward. And generally speaking, there's only certain types of bills that you can do where you feel like it's worth putting something out to consultation. It doesn't require a significant amount of urgency to do so. There's an opportunity within the sector to really come to a consensus model, and so on and so forth. One thing I would also say, which nobody ever talks about, which I think is one I like sort of bringing up as a little bugbear of mine, is post-legislative scrutiny. We never really talk about that at all. And it's something that I think should be done more of, particularly on bills I think that have had pre-leg scrutiny in the past, or that have been big structural reforms to a sector. And the government itself should commit, even though there's been a change of colour of government, should commit to responding to more of these and encouraging more of these, just in terms of better practice of legislation.
That's right. And actually, those are both things, both pre-leg and post-leg scrutiny, are things that select committees can do, aren't they? If they choose to. Normally for a pre-leg scrutiny would set up a joint committee of the Commons and the Lords specifically for that, but actually Commons committees can also pick up parts or whole other bills if they think that they want to do some of that scrutiny. Just say a word for us, Chris, about what your expectations are in terms of the setup of select committees. We've got this slightly odd timing with the election just before the summer recess. Obviously, people like the IFG are always very keen to see select committees set up, and that scrutiny process, which you described, that we think is really important in terms of making policy as effective as it can be and spotting any loopholes that haven't been thought about. Is really keen that scrutiny that scrutiny of government policy gets set up. But what do you think the mechanics will be now?
Well, we've only got, 13 days to the end of the month, and that's when the House rises under the new timetable that the Labour government has set out. I don't think, unless I've missed it in the last couple of days, that we've seen yet the allocation of committees come out, or indeed the proportion of seats and votes that will happen. So it's all done on seats won at the previous general election, not based on if someone defects to another party. That won't affect the number of seats that happen. So there's the whip's offices and the usual channels will be having a sort of private discussion based on the formula that the speaker provides. There are some committee chairs that will always go to particular parties. So Treasury always goes to the government. Generally speaking, the business committee tends to go to the opposition, and then others will be set up. But given the situation where Labour have won such a vast majority of seats, you will have them holding much more of the committee chairs positions, and they will also hold more of the seats. So on a committee of 11, I mean, I haven't done the maths on this, but I'm assuming that probably 7, maybe 8 of the seats will be given to Labour, meaning only 3 or 4 will be given to the opposition parties, which means that in some cases the Conservatives may only have a couple of seats on committees. Now, if you think about how committees themselves are done on when they draw up reports, are done on majority model, then that basically means that as long as Labour sort of turns up, they should, in theory, have a majority. Now, of course, it depends whether there's any cross-cutting issues. I thought, for example, I thought DWP might have an issue on the sort of two-child limit benefit issues as one of the first big significant tests of the Labour majority, because it doesn't really matter, even if you've got a 180-seat majority. You saw under Blair in the first era that first Parliament that he was PM for, there are always issues that will ensure that majority is tested no matter how big it is. So we could see something like that cropping up, causing issues in select committees and so on. But in terms of timetables, I think you might just squeeze elections to select committee chairs in before the summer recess. Possible they may not even manage that. You certainly won't get a full committee set up. That'll have to wait until September when everyone comes back. And also the final point, select committee chairs now, as they have been since coalition reforms, are elected by the whole House, and individual members are elected by their own parties.
Yeah, and that can produce them. I was remembering back in the 2010 Parliament, we actually did have some first term MPs elected to run select committees. I think Rory Stewart and Sarah Wollaston both stood and were elected. So it's not necessarily just the people who are already well known, former ministers, former MPs who might choose to stand for those. Okay, we haven't got long left, so I'm going to just ask one final question and ask you each to give me your view before we wrap up. And that's just to ask, in terms of sort of success and failures, in terms of what previous administrations have done in terms of translating their sort of aspirations in terms of legislation in a King's or previously Queen's speech into reality. What are the lessons that Keir Starmer and his government should learn from those who have gone before? Jill, I'm going to start with you because you've got your microphone off.
I think one of the lessons is that if they're bringing in things, to actually regard the process of scrutiny and debate as an opportunity for improving legislation, rather than ensuring that you just hold the line against all criticisms. And we actually saw the big Andrew Lansley NHS reorganisation have to be paused in the coalition's first legislative session because it had run into such degrees of opposition, because the then Health Secretary had really just brushed aside all the incredibly negative responses to his consultation on his proposals for reorganisation. And that really does hang as a bit of an albatross over that government, I think, because nobody really ever understood the point of those reforms. And then it cost the then Health Secretary his job, and his successor then proceeded to undo them through the back door. So I think, don't be sort of put off by some of the ambitions, but where people do genuinely come up with ideas for improvement, listen to those. And I think it'd be really interesting to see what approach the Labour whips take to staffing some of the bill committees, whether they sort of follow the time-honoured practice that if you know anything about it, you go nowhere near that bill committee, or whether they are actually prepared to have some people who may add a bit of value, even if they do it behind closed doors, of just saying, I think we're running aground on this. So I think it'd be really, really interesting to see. And the other bit is I hope we only get one finance bill a year rather than multiple ones.
We'll continue to make that case. Alex, what do you think?
Thanks. I'll be quick. I've just scribbled down a few things as Jill was speaking. I think, firstly, stick at it. One of the things we said earlier was that the kind of chopping and changing of the last few years has been really unhelpful. So having a consistent theme for the whole Parliament that you play into, and hopefully the mission stuff will help on that. Secondly, don't forget the House of Lords. It's really easy to forget the House of Lords. You don't have a majority in the Lords. They will give way eventually, almost certainly, but in the end, you can cause yourself no end of trouble by underestimating the importance of the House of Lords. Passing a bill is not a test of success. It's actually improving things in the real world for citizens and making changes actually happen. So the royal assent is the start of the process rather than the end of it. And similarly, legislation is not everything. There's loads of things. I mean, I take your point on secondary legislation and being responsible on that, but let's see. I think when governments have powers, they tend to use them. But even beyond the legislative sphere, there's so much that is important about government doing operating services and improving the way government works. So lots can be done non-legislatively. And then Jill's point about openness and being, I think one of the things we learned from the Theresa May parliaments was that being too closed and not actually bringing Parliament into the process, but sort of presenting it with a fait accompli and then expecting it to comply is a mistake.
Chris, final word to you.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I'm going to gently admonish Jill for giving away trade secrets. Not allowed to do that on Institute for Government podcast, are we? But there we go. No, I think the big thing for me is sort of riffing slightly on Alex's point around, legislation isn't the be all and end all. There is a huge amount in this session of Parliament, where they are doing some really significant structural reforms, like taking railways back into public ownership, setting up GB Energy. That's even before we get onto the planning reforms and so on. So they're doing the right thing, right? The Labour government coming in, doing what they want to do, making a structural reforms. But the success of what they achieve in the long run will be measured about the effectiveness of the bodies that they set up and the ability of those bodies to affect the change that the Labour government wants to achieve. So in a way, it's all very well sort of setting up the bodies, creating them and so on. But actually the scrutiny then of those bodies and how Parliament interacts with them in the future is really, really important. You only have to look at the sort of wrangles between the FCA and Parliament and government and other regulators in recent years to show that just sort of farming out sort of powers and delegated powers to arm's length bodies and then sort of forgetting about them just doesn't work. And so the role of scrutiny and the role of government in enforcing what it wants to deliver through these bodies is absolutely critical. It just can't be forgotten.
I'll heartily endorse that one. I'm afraid that's it for today's webinar. Many thanks to everybody who tuned in and stuck with us despite various technical problems, all on my side. Many thanks to Jill, Alex, and especially to you, Chris, for coming along and giving us the benefit of your expertise and experience. The audio of this event will be available on our IFG Events podcast feed a little later on, so you can watch the whole thing back if you wish to, or recommend it to your friends. And the recording will also be on our website. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone, and we will see you at the IFG for our next event. Thanks very much.